Hey, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem Yahushai, Bahashem Rakakodash. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, who all in this true form and rule well. Peace have tasted 144,000, and the rest of the 1/3, the large multitude. Unto you I say shalom. Coming to you back with another lesson through the Spirit. And the title for this was going to be, these tariffs will only increase the hell that these Americans and Canadians are going through. Because as the average American is struggling, to pay rent, to make ends meet, to buy groceries, to pay their light bill or whatever bills they got, because inflation is rising at a record high. And these tariffs that Donald Trump, the current president, is imposing on Mexico, Canada, and these different European nations, raising these tariffs up 25%, it's not going to help with the economy. It's only going to make it worse, because we see, and even us in this truth, that groceries, rent, and different bills are only getting more expensive. But that's a result of the constant printing of the US dollar. That's why all these nations are doing away with the dollar. You got the BRICS being established, or already established, but you got all these different countries applying to join BRICS, which BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. I think that's it. Let me look it up real quick. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which a lot of countries, for the majority, have applied to join BRICS, which basically what the end goal is to do away with the dollar. But before that happens, the dollar is going to slowly deteriorate, which is already happening. The U.S. debt, the U.S. national debt, as of right now, it's about almost $36 trillion, which, is not going to be paid off. So the only way to get rid of this national debt is going to be the way by resetting the economy. And when that's done, that's going to lead the digital era of money, of currency being established by the way of the CBDCs, the Fed now, and it's all going to be a gradual process, but a quick process too, because this devil doesn't have a long time to establish his NWO. Ultimately to establish this NWO by the way of the Charagma, by the way of the MOTB. But first he has to slowly but surely destroy this dollar. And, he's starting to do it. Or 5 years ago, he printed out all these stimulus checks, which was stupid because it was only going to make the economy worse. And now we're seeing the results of that. And now he's imposing these 25% tariffs. They are going to make the price of goods go up, which they're already going up. You got eggs going for almost $10. You got bread, milk, just the basic essentials running you up, $100 just to get basic, the basic needs, your eggs, your milk, your bread, maybe some chicken. It's running you up $100, and it probably will last you the week. But to even pay rent now is going above $1,000. Anywhere between $1,000 and $1,500 to $2,000 just to get an apartment. And don't even let me get started on these mortgages, going for thousands of dollars, and these prices are gonna eventually collapse. The bubble's gonna pop because they're unsustainable. these people's salaries are pretty much being stagnant while these prices of all these different goods are constantly rising. So those salaries aren't keeping up with the inflation, which ultimately, when it goes into hyperinflation, the people aren't going to be willing to pay $100 for a dozen of eggs, $200 for a loaf of bread, $250 for a bar of soap. These are all prices that people aren't going to willing to do. So eventually they're going to start rioting. They're going to go into these different grocery stores, these different pharmacies, liquor stores, like how they always do in the movies. Those are the first place to be raided because ultimately these are essentials. That's why the average American, they pretty much haven't rioted. They haven't tried to overthrow the government because, they have bread and circus. And as long as you give them bread and circus, they're never going to revolt. But once you take that away, the bread and the entertainment of these Babylonians, these Americans, that's when eventually they're going to want to overthrow the government. Because if you play with these people's food or entertainment or with their money, then that's when they're going to want to riot. But for now, they're comfortable. Victuals should be so cheap upon earth. They should think themselves to be in good case, which, you can still go to the grocery store and afford groceries, for a relatively affordable price. But it's going to get to that point where it's going to be hyperinflation. And the only solution that this devil is going to offer is going to be by the way of that charagma, the MOTB, when that great famine hits. But ultimately, this is all judgment from Yahweh Shem Yahushai, sending these plagues upon the planet Earth for all the wickedness, especially here in America, the land of opportunity, the virgin land that has never been touched, but eventually it's going to get touched by the way of that fire. Where first Yahweh Shem Yahushai is going to send these different plagues to break it down limb by limb. This is Sirach chapter 39 verse 28. There be spirits that are created for vengeance, which in their fury lay on sore strokes. In time of destruction, they pour out their force and appease the wrath of him that made them. So ultimately, it's a spirit, but a spirit created for vengeance, ultimately to judge these wicked ass, 2/3, these wicked ass heathens that are settled on their leads. But now they're starting to feel that squeeze, pressure from above and pressure from below. And eventually it's going to get to that point where there's not going to be any food available. But Esau, Edom, the self-proclaimed white man, the devil, he's going to come down with a solution by the way of that charagma, which majority of these people are going to be willing to take, because there's not going to be any food, there's not going to be any water, any shelter. But the way to access all these different goods, all these different dainties, is going to be by the way of taking that charagma. Our people, 2/3 of our people, they're not going to trust in Yahweh Shem Yahushai to provide for them. They're going to go down to Egypt and take that MOTB to be able to eat. Verse 29, fire and hell and famine and death, all these were created for vengeance. So ultimately, all these different plagues that are happening upon the planet Earth, they're all spirits created for vengeance to judge the wicked, because majority of the nation of Israel, comprised of you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, they're pretty much settled on their leads. They're comfortable here in America because they have the food, they have the entertainment, they have the clothing, they have their so-called good paying jobs. But when all that gets taken away, that's when they're going to be sighing and crying, for somebody to save them. But they're not going to lean on Yahweh Shem Yahushai to save them. They're going to lean on this devil, Esau, Edom, to be their savior. And they're going to go down to these different shipping stations and take the MOTB to be able to eat. But even so, a lot of our people who take that charagma, still aren't going to be able to eat, even after they, go down and take it to be able to eat again. This is 2nd Ezra chapter 15 and verse 5. Behold, said Yahweh Shemel Shai, I will bring plagues upon the world, the sword, famine, death, and destruction. And that's currently what we're seeing. We're seeing all these different signs, from earthquakes in diverse places, hurricanes, tornadoes, people being mauled by animals, people getting ran over, wars and rumors of wars. These are all signs and tokens that the end of this wicked ass rulership being ran by Esau Edom is near. The destruction of America. But first is going to be plagued by all these different, pestilences, from diseases. You had the seedemic 5 years ago. That was the plague. Then you had the destruction of all these different food processing plants. You had these trail derailments, and now you have planes falling out the sky. These are all different plagues being sent by Yahweh Shemel Shai, just like in ancient Egypt. It didn't collapse in one day, but it was a process over time, and that's currently what's going on with America. It's going to be the same process over again, but in that final plague, by the way of those ICBMs, those intercontinental ballistic missiles, it is going to destroy America in 1 hour, But that's going to be that nail in the coffin to utterly waste this place. But first is going to be plagued by all these different famines, pestilences, and destruction. Get this next one. This is Ezekiel 14 and verse 13. Son of man, when the land sinneth against me by trespassing grievously, then will I stretch out my hand upon it, and I will break the staff of the bread thereof, and will send famine upon it, and will cut off man and beast from it. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the staff of bread being cut off, by all these different pricing of these different goods. You're going to have the price of avocados, different fruits and vegetables, tequila, beer, from Mexico, and from the Canada tariffs, you're going to have fish, maple syrup, different cuts of beef, pretty much rising in price, which is going to make it to the point where people aren't going to be able to afford groceries. They're going to either have to pay their rent, feed themselves or feed their children, which we're already starting to see that. But how much more now when all these different prices of goods, when they're starting posting these tariffs on a mass scale. This is Haggai chapter 1 and verse 6. Ye have sown much and bring in little. Ye eat, but ye have not enough. Ye drink, but ye are not filled with drink. Ye clothe you, but there is none warm. And he that earneth wages to put in a bag with holes. So all these Americans, they're constantly going to work, working 60, 70 hours a week, but they still don't have enough. They barely have enough to make ends meet, have enough barely to pay their rent or buy groceries. But other than that, pretty much it's just a hamster on a wheel, never being able to get ahead, because ultimately this system isn't set up for people to get ahead. That middle class is pretty much done away with. And now in 2025, all we have is either, the rich, the 1%, or the poor. That middle class has been eliminated, and it all started about 5 years ago when eventually that middle class was done away with. So how much more now? It don't matter if you make six figures, you get taxed even more. You pretty much can't win here in America because this place wasn't designed for people to succeed. Eventually it's going to be destroyed by the way of fire. But, those who are putting their trust in Yahweh Shem Shai, they're going to be provided for when all hell breaks loose. They're going to have food. They're going to be they're going to have food. They're going to have water. They're going to have shelter and raiment. But, 2/3 of our people who are going to go down to Egypt and trust this devil Esau Edom, they're pretty much going to either starve to death or get put to death, by the way of the sword. This is Lamentations chapter 4 and verse 9. They that be slain with the sword are better than they that be slain with hunger, for these pine away, stricken through for the want of the fruits of the field. So it's better to get put to death by the way of the sword, which today's sword is the gun, than to starve to death, because starving to death, that's a slow and painful, agonizing death. First your organs are gonna eat themselves. You're gonna get to the point where you're gonna be malnourished. Your ribs are gonna be touching your stomach, and that's a horrible way to go out. You might start hallucinating and start eating your arm. That's a horrible way to go out. But a lot of these people, they're going to go out by the way of famine. They're going to eat their family members. They're going to resort back to cannibalism. But the hopeful elect, they're going to be provided in that day, ultimately for repenting and turning back to Yahweh Shem Shai in truth and sincerity. This is Isaiah 65 and 13. Therefore thus said the Lord Yahweh Shem Shai, behold, my servants shall eat, but ye shall be hungry. Behold, my servants shall drink, but ye shall be thirsty. Behold, my servants shall rejoice, but ye shall be ashamed. And ultimately, those who are serving Yahweh Shem Shai in truth and sincerity, who have repented and turned back, to the true and living power, are going to be able to be provided in that day, by Yahweh Shem Shai. But 2/3 of our people, they're not putting their trust in Yahweh Shem Shai right now. So how much more when all hell breaks loose? A lot of them are going to want to repent, but it's going to be too late. They're going to have to eat the fruit of their actions. They're going to have to be held accountable for all the sins and iniquity they were doing. Because they're not going to be covered by Yahweh Shai's blood. They're going to be held to the standard of the law. Verse 14, behold, my servants shall sing for joy of heart, but ye shall cry for sorrow of heart, and shall howl for vexation of spirit. And that's what a lot of these people are already doing. These Americans, they're already crying out because of the outrageous prices in these different goods, these different groceries, rent. So how much more when all hell breaks loose and there isn't any food in the grocery store? There isn't any pharmacies, being able to provide these different prescription meds. People are going to be bugging out. But the elect, us in this knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of the hopeful elect, we have this knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, like in Isaiah 33 and 6. Knowledge, wisdom, and understanding should be the stability of thy times. But these people aren't going to be stable. They're going to be bugging out. They're not going to have any wisdom. They're not going to have any food, any water, and they're just going to completely bug out and go crazy. But that's pretty much the point. I pray this is edifying to the elect. I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem Rakakodash, and double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, who are in this truth from the root well. Peace had tasted 144,000, and the rest of the 1/3, the large multitude, unto you I say Shalom.